Hi, everybody. I'm KVUE senior reporter Tony Plahetsky. A jury in Austin has convicted Kaitlin Armstrong on a murder charge in the 2022 death of Mariah Wilson, acclaimed cyclist. This is a case that has drawn global attention, and we want to talk to two legal experts to break down not only today's developments, but the entire trial that has spanned a couple of weeks here in Austin. Joining me now are Austin attorneys James Wood and Lindsay Richards. Thank you both for being here with us.
Thank you, Tony.
Thank you for having me.
So just want to ask both of you for your general impressions of the guilty verdict. Lindsay, were you surprised at all when this jury came down so quickly?
I was surprised at how quickly it did happen. Usually in murders, it takes quite a bit of time, but I think the evidence was so overwhelming here. It really didn't take them any time at all.
About 2.5 hours. James, how about you? Any surprise that the jury came back so quickly?
I wouldn't say I was surprised because as I was following, on Twitter and on the KVUE live feed of us, watching the closing arguments, I was also paying attention to the public's comments, and that gave me a little insight to what the jury might be thinking. So the public's comments indicated they thought it could be as quick as a Jimmy John's order. There were some really interesting comments on how fast the public expected the jury to come back. And so, that's a little sample of what the jury might have been thinking.
Just going back over the past couple of weeks when this trial has played out, I know both of you, I've seen both of you in the courtroom at different times. Lindsay, what was your impression of the evidence and what prosecutors describe as the weight of the evidence? Ricky Jones, one of the leading prosecutors, said today in his closing statements that he's never seen so much evidence against a defendant. Do you share that view?
I do think that there was a great deal of circumstantial evidence, which is usually the majority of what you're going to have is circumstantial evidence in any kind of criminal case. I think the prosecutors were incredibly thorough in their approach, making sure that they dotted every I, crossed every T, and that's why they had such a tremendous number of witnesses to make sure that they brought forth every piece of evidence. Some they probably didn't even have to be honest, but they made sure that they brought that jury everything they could possibly need to find her guilty.
James, we're talking about forensic evidence, ballistic evidence. Obviously, there was witness testimony as well. What, from an evidentiary standpoint, stood out to you in terms of the volume of evidence and actual evidence that you think maybe helped seal this case?
Well, isn't it interesting that the two sides agreed that there was a mountain of evidence? Both sides, we saw both sides say there's a mountain of evidence. This is the most evidence I've ever seen coming from the state. And then also coming from the defendant's table, them talking about Kaitlin being caught in a nightmare of circumstantial evidence. And when they say nightmare, they were indicating they knew there was so much evidence. And, we watched an opening statements and we said, this is going to be a very thorough trial. The state is going to make their case with a fine-tooth comb, and they sure did. And they went over a lot of evidence.
Was there a particular piece of evidence that stood out to either of you? Was it the DNA evidence on the bicycle? Was it the ballistic evidence that prosecutors say linked Kaitlin Armstrong's a gun found in her home to shell casings? Lindsay, was there a particular item or a particular piece of testimony that stood out to you?
In any murder trial, you're going to have ballistics. Hopefully, you're going to have some sort of DNA that puts your defendant at the scene. And so those are things that you're typically looking for, that you're going to want to see when you're trying a murder case. The interesting thing for me that I thought was super powerful that the prosecutors did was near the end of their case, they brought their witness that showed all of the text messages alongside the GPS and the GPS data from the cell phones and also from her vehicle. And they put all of that together to really allow the jury to see what was happening, the communications that were going on, and where she was located throughout that entire time as those communications were taking place. And I think that was their most powerful testimony that they really had. And they very wisely kept that until the end to make sure that the jury, that was kind of the last thing they heard as far as their evidence was concerned. And I do think what was really fascinating to me that I was reminded of during closing arguments this morning was that she was circling that area. Her vehicle, that black Jeep, was circling the area prior to the murder occurring. And I thought that was very powerful testimony and evidence that was presented.
James, it's a reminder that whatever we Google, whatever we text, wherever we drive, our actions are being documented and could be used against us should we be prosecuted for a crime.
Yes, and we talked about this when we watched opening statements, that the digital footprint is so great now. You know, we saw evidence that the neighbor's camera picked up on this. And then we saw evidence that Kaitlin might have done one thing to cover up her crime, and that was turning her phone off for a short amount of time, not knowing that her Jeep was still tracking her. And so the digital footprint is just everywhere, and it creates, a very precise roadmap to, the guilt in this case.
Lindsay, we've talked about this before, but if you're a defense attorney, by many accounts, at least among people who have been following this case, they really had an uphill climb. What is your assessment of how they performed with what they had to work with?
Well, and I'll tell you, I was a prosecutor for many years, and I am now a defense attorney. So I definitely understand both sides of what you need to do and the battles that you are encountering in these jobs. They did have an uphill battle, and I think two of their biggest obstacles, were the 2 times that she fled, essentially. And that's really hard to help people to understand. They did exactly what they were supposed to do, which is paint doubt and to poke holes in the investigation that took place and try to say, look, there were people that weren't spoken to. There were situations that were not examined. There is alternative explanations that might exist for some of her behavior. So they really did what they could do with the evidence that was there. But again, it was just such an overwhelming trial with the evidence that they did everything they could, but this was the verdict.
James, do you feel as though it was almost insurmountable for the defense?
I do, and I know the lawyers involved. I think they're great lawyers. I think that the facts they had to work with were basically an impossible uphill battle. And as lawyers, as litigators, we really like when we actually get to trials. That's kind of the fun part sometimes. But you want the role of the evidence being on your side so that you have the winning argument. It's not as fun to go into a case where you might be saying things that aren't true. You might have to make an argument of doubt when you might not have doubt yourself. And so I've been curious to think about, had the lawyers switched teams, how the case would have gone differently if they just had better facts to work with.
Going into this, I think a lot of people were questioning whether or not Kaitlin Armstrong would testify. And that was a question that, as the defense was putting on their case, I think a lot of people were having. Lindsay, are you surprised that she didn't take the stand in her own defense?
I'm not surprised. That is typically what you would advise anyone who's being accused of a crime to do. In most situations, you're going to say, don't take the stand for a number of reasons. And the main one being the burden's always on the state, right? They have to prove the case, and if they don't, then there's no reason for you to put yourself in that position. Here, but it's also human nature for anyone to want to hear from a defendant and hear their side of the story and hear what they have to say. It doesn't surprise me that they told her, and I don't know if they told her not to testify or if it was her choice or how that went about. In the end, she obviously decided not to testify, and I think that was probably a wise decision on her part. And I think that was the right choice, so it doesn't necessarily surprise me. But of course, we all would have loved to have heard what she had to say.
Including you, James.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think everybody wants to know what's on her mind. And I think that part of this trial, she didn't really do herself any favors by, I think that it was very evident and reported on by most people in the courtroom that she showed no emotion throughout the entire trial. And so the jury has the best view of her face, and they're watching her have no emotional reaction to things that should just defend you in general as a human being when you see a body torn apart, a young person's life cut short. Those things should make you squirm. And we saw most of the people in the courtroom were squirming, except for Kaitlin Armstrong. And I don't think that the jury viewed that favorably.
I want to ask you both, what happens now? I mean, obviously there is punishment, but does she appeal? And potentially, Lindsay, on what grounds? If you're an appellate lawyer and she comes to across your desk, what do you do?
I will tell you usually what you see is for any, especially a conviction as serious as a murder conviction. And she's looking at a wide range of punishment. And my guess is she's receiving probably a hefty prison sentence would be what I would anticipate. I do think she will appeal because most convictions for serious felonies, you're going to want to appeal your conviction for some reason. The most common that you see is ineffective assistance of counsel. I do not think her counsel was by any means ineffective. I think they did their job exactly the way that they needed to and defended her to the best of their ability, and most decisions made were probably trial strategy. I don't know, not having seen every bit of testimony that came out, what her other grounds for appeal might be. But we'll see. I'm sure she'll find one.
How about you, James? You think an appeal is coming?
It very well could be. You know, it's just the grounds are going to be, like Lindsay said, it's going to be hard to find the grounds for a real appeal. You know, when you mention ineffective assistance of counsel, that's basically saying my lawyers didn't do a good job. They dropped the ball. And we saw these lawyers fight for her in this case. You wouldn't have seen the state objecting to their putting on a case if they weren't actively fighting on her behalf. They gave it their best shot. We saw them, show up from the beginning till the end, even as the public's perception and, what was being reported on, there's a large assumption of guilt, and they're still there showing up and putting on this case. And they're going so far as to make arguments that might even push the envelope to where the state objects. And so I don't think the ineffective assistance of counsel is going to work for her in this one.
I just want to ask you both, because I think it's so important that we remember that there is a victim, a young woman, a 25-year-old Mariah Wilson, who by every account was a rising star in the cycling community, had so much going for her. I know this may be a difficult question to answer, but in general, does a guilty verdict in a trial like this bring a measure of resolution to victims' families? You've worked on both sides of the aisle. Lindsay, what is your experience around that?
There is some resolution, I would say, for families, just having a sense that there is justice for what happened to their daughter, to their sister, to their friend, that there is a consequence for what happened. And so in that sense, I think that there is some closure. But the reality is it never brings the closure you want, because unfortunately your child is still gone. And so it never fully, and that never heals. And so it's never full closure, but at least that there's some sense of justice and some sense that there is a repercussion for what has happened to their child.
We saw them, James, in the courtroom, Mariah Wilson's parents, her brother, other friends
Right.
and family members who obviously were visibly stricken at different times.
Right. I think that this verdict will definitely ease their minds as much as it can. As Lindsay said, we can't go back in time. But people don't like being parties in legal proceedings. They don't like going through trials. People don't enjoy being in the hot seat. And while the family is watching this, I'm sure that they're also thinking about, what if she gets off on a loophole? Look at what happened with Casey Anthony. Look at what happened with O.J. Simpson trials. And so the family is sitting there worried that a verdict might come back in the wrong way. And so to have the verdict come back, I'm sure to them was, a form of relief, at least of this chapter.
James Wood, Lindsay Richards, thank you both so much for joining us. We really, really appreciate your time. And
Thank you.
we'll, of course, continue to follow this case through its punishment phase and, of course, any appeals that may be forthcoming. Thank you for joining us.